So there's a few ways we can go about debugging this program. First is to put in some print statements and print out the results, and we can then try to figure out what's going on. For example, we might put right in the beginning of each loop, print out run stars and see what our current run length is. And that probably give us some useful information. That might even help us figure it out. But we've done that kind of thing before, so I don't want to do that. The next thing we can do is draw on a piece of paper a little diagram with each variable across the top with its value, and just manually go through the code and step through the code line by line, and every time a variable changes we put in the current value of the variable, and if the value changes again we cross it off and put a new value underneath, and we end up keeping a running set of all of the variables, which represents the current state of the program. And by doing that, we're going to really dive into all of the details, and there's a pretty good chance we'll be able to figure out what's going wrong. That's fairly time consuming, and it's actually hard for me to show in the video because I can't easily show you the code and a drawing at the same time. So that gives me a great opportunity to introduce the third way, which is to use the debugger. The debugger is a tool in PyCharm, and actually it's available in just about every programming environment and every programming language, which lets you step through the code line by line as if we were doing it on paper, but instead of us having to do it line by line in our heads and keep the values of all of the states of the variables on paper, the computer does it for us, because really we are running the program just like we normally would on the computer, but we can do it line by line. That's great. But sometimes it's a pain in the neck because you've got a lot of code to execute, and rather than stepping through every single line, you want to just say, I think there's a problem over here, so I want to run until the program gets to this point and then stop, and then let me investigate. And we can do that too with the debugger, and that's called setting a breakpoint. So let's jump right in and start that. I'm not interested in executing these lines of code line by line because we know those are just initialization. I'm interested in the meat of the loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint at this line number 13, previous letter. And there's a few ways to set a breakpoint in PyCharm, but the easiest way is to use this blank column right here. You may have wondered why that wasted space is there, and the reason is you can just click on that and it sets a breakpoint. It puts this red dot here, which is like a stop sign that says it's going to stop, and marks the whole line as red, and it knows that when you're running it in the debugger, it's going to stop there. Now, there's two ways to run a program. You can just regular run it, in which case it ignores breakpoints, or you can run it in the debugger, which is really just running it again, but it runs it with some special information some special information tracking behind the scenes, and it will stop at all the breakpoints. Sure you've seen me pressing this triangle all the time to run the program. There's also another button right over here that has a little picture of a green bug, and it says debug. So let's click on this and see what happens. A new window pops up on the bottom. This time it's the debug window. It's got a bunch of information, including, look at this, the value of all of the variables. This is the state. It's got data, which is the string. It got all of these other variables, which are currently 0. And it's got something here on the left called the stack trace, which tells us which function we're inside of, and if a function called that one, which called it. And you read it from the bottom up to the top. So we're currently in the function process string, and it was called by the module, right? Because it sort of just started from the top. But this is more useful when you have one function that you've written that calls another, and so on. All right, so now what we want to do is step through a line of code. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few ways. Along here in the debugger, there's some graphical buttons that tell us things like, let's mouse over and get the tooltip, step over the current line of code. That's cool, that's what we want to do. So let's click on that, and it executes to the next line of code. Prev letter is now set to an empty string, which you can see on the bottom. There are some other options. This is the one we're going to use most for the moment, but there's some other options, which is if we're about to make a function call, you have to decide when you're stepping through, do you want to actually step into that function call and trace the lines of code in that function, or do you just want to execute that function and then keep on running where you were? So this will step over, right? In other words, it'll actually run the function, but the debugger will show you the next line of code after the function. I said just the opposite. This is step into. This goes into the function. Okay, and this one is step out, which means it will keep on running until this function returns, and what we were doing, the first thing, is step over. Alright, so now we don't have many function calls here, or any function call, so we can just use stepping over. If letter is star, it is. Then we're going to increment our stars by 1. So we execute this next line of code. We'll just scroll down here and see now, sure enough, stars has gone from 0 to 1. If previous letter is a star, well, we can look here. Previous letter is an empty string because this is the first thing. And so, well, this is not going to execute. So run stars does not get incremented. Remember, this is our bug that we're trying to figure out, is how comes our run length never gets incremented? And the answer is right here, well, we're only incrementing it if the previous letter was a star. Well, the first character we're skipping over, and so that doesn't happen. Alright, so let's keep on going for a little bit longer and see what we can figure out. Actually, our run stars get set to 1 right now, so that seems okay. Ah, interesting. If run dashes is greater than max dashes, so we're updating our max dashes, but we never update our maximum stars, and that was the problem. And that makes sense because we were going to update when we only update the maximum when we switch, and when we switch 2 stars, that's when we update the maximum dashes. Well, when we update the when we finish a star run, which we'll see only when we see a dash, that's when we update the maximum number of stars. And we're not doing that now because we didn't write that other line of code. So maybe this is actually okay after all, and we just need to write this other bit of code. So just so you can see this, there's some other buttons on the side here that are important. This special kind of right green arrow says resume program, and if we click this, it'll keep on running until it hits the next breakpoint. We actually don't have any other breakpoints inside this loop, so it'll actually go to the end. But in fact, we don't even want to do that. I'm just done. So I'm going to press this red stop button, and it's going to stop the program, kill the process in the computer, and the debugger is, we're done, so we can close that. We don't need this breakpoint anymore. Let's go and write the other half of this program. It's almost the same, so we'll just copy and paste it and sort of switch everything around. Else, if it was a dash, we have to sort of do the opposite in each case. Instead of updating stars, we want to update dashes. If the previous letter was also a dash, then we want to increment our run length of dashes. If, on the other hand, is the end, we're ending the run of the stars, then we want to set our run length of dashes to 1 because we're starting a new one of those. And we want to reset our run length of stars to 0. Haha, and I think I'm just seeing the bug. Do you see it? We set our run length of stars to 0, and then, I'm going to switch this around, we check that run length. But we would have seen this in the debugger if we had gotten here. First we set our run length of stars to 0, and then we tried to update our maximum. That clearly is the wrong order. We need to update it first, update our maximum first, while we have its current value before we reset it. And let's do the same thing here. Alright, let's try running this. Let's try it without the debugger and see what values we get. Look at this. Number of stars is 8. Maximum stars is 4. That's correct. Number of dashes is 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And maximum dashes is 5. I think we fixed our bug.